First, then, I should probably say what I mean by Hackney. What I mean is without Shoreditch, although I'm going to mention Shoreditch occasionally, but I'm really talking about Hackney and Stoke Newington, which at that time were united in terms of population, for population purposes. My Hackney then, if I can put it that way, was a predominantly rural suburb of the great city to the south. It was home in 1801, the first year we have accurate population statistics, to just over 14,000 people. So around the present population of Bodmin in Cornwall, but not quite so pretty. In 1801, the population was growing and had been for many years. It was rising fast enough in 1789 for Hackney Vestry to determine on building a new church, for instance, for the needs of a growing congregation. The vestry was proved right because the parish combined with Stoke Newington would be home to nearly 19,000 people in 1811 and over 25,000 in 1821. These were formative decades for the growth of London as a whole, largely based on the extraordinary prosperity of wartime London in these years. Who lived in Hackney? Broadly, there were two kinds of population. One was essentially rural, based on farming and market gardening. 2/3 of farms were under grass and given over to cow keeping and milk production. There were said to be 600 cows in Hackney in 1795. And the market gardens included the famous hothouses of Joachim Loddiges, a German migrant who had introduced the rhododendron to Britain earlier in the century. There was also some industry. The soil in Hackney made excellent brick earth, so brickmaking was a constant smelly and smoky presence in the fields and had been for generations. Hackney clay used to make London stock brick for a growing metropolis. There were lead mills at Temple Mills on the Essex border, a silk mill, said to be the largest in the country, at the Wick, employing 600 mainly female hands in silk throwing and finishing. There were calico dyers and calico printers, and Berger's colour-making works were already well established at Homerton. Hackney Council's Environmental Health and Social Services departments occupied the later Berger factory in Morning Lane in my days there in the early 1980s. I don't know if they're still based in Morning Lane, those two departments, but anyway, hence the dreams, that's all I'd say. Most Hackney residents were truly suburbans, though. They earned a living mainly in the City of London, and most of them were people of the middling sort, tradesmen who had their family homes in Hackney while continuing to live over their city shops in the week, many merchants and legal clerks who walked into the city 6 days a week but preferred Hackney's clean air to the city's smoke, and some better off merchants who had the larger detached houses in private grounds. And then there were the men and women who catered for the middling sort needs. The large number of people working in domestic service, the carters and others who delivered goods, the innkeepers and their staff waiting on people, constantly moving in and out of London and so on. As a consequence, and not unexpectedly, the population was strongly feminized in character. There were 35% more women in Hackney than men in 1801. All of this would have been fairly typical of the semi-rural belt around London, of Islington, say, or St Pancras, and it stood in sharp contrast with Shoreditch to the south, which was far more plebeian and working class, with some living on the margins of wage labour or entirely living on their wits. Shoreditch, which had a population some 2.5 times larger than Hackney in 1801, around 35,000 people, had much more in common with its inner city neighbours like Finsbury, say, or Clerkenwell, than its neighbour to the north. And Shoreditch was very much London city overspill. There was one thing about Hackney, though, that was not typical at all, and which marked it out distinctively from its neighbours. That was its long connection with religious dissent, with those Protestants who rejected the authority of the Church of England and who chose to worship their God in their own way. They were a disputatious bunch, and often disputatious among themselves, forming splinter congregations or espousing this or that element of Bible theology as teaching or preaching encouraged over time. They had built up strong community traditions in Hackney and Stoke Newington even before the turbulent days of the English Revolution in the middle of the 17th century. So they were here by 1789 for well over 100 years. The key spots were around Mare Street, in Homerton, and Newington Green. Homerton was home to the Protestant Dissenting Academy, established in the early 18th century to train dissenting preachers in theology. It moved from the city to Homerton around 1768 and was an important institution for dissenters in the whole of England and Wales. More important for our story was the old gravel pit meeting house, or chapel, originally near Mare Street from around 1715, then moving to Chatham Place, Homerton, where the preacher from 1770 to 1791 was Dr. Richard Price, a celebrated theologian, demographer, and radical philosopher. Prior to that, he had preached at the Presbyterian Meeting House on the north side of Newington Green from around 1758. Price lived at 54 on the Green in what is considered the oldest brick-built terraced houses in London. Mary Wollstonecraft, the radical feminist philosopher, was one of Price's congregation at the Newington Green Chapel, which had been erected in or near 1708 and which, of course, is happily still with us. There are other famous dissenting connections, but they're not part of our story. Hackney's connection with dissent would give it a unique position in the country's response to the promise and the challenge of the revolution in France that came to a head in the summer of 1789. The reception in Britain of the convocation of the Estates General, weakening the autocratic power of King Louis XVI and his court, appeared as the dawn of French liberty and was generally welcomed by the British political classes, at the very beginning anyway. The applause in many places was profuse, even ecstatic, ignoring for the moment the blood-soaked streets of Paris. Charles James Fox, long-term leader of the aristocratic Whig Party, now firmly in the parliamentary opposition, and an unrelenting critic of kingly power in Britain, wrote privately of the fall of the Bastille, how much the greatest event it is that ever happened in the world, and how much the best. His enthusiasm was widely shared in and out of Parliament. To give just one instance of popular enthusiasm, at Anstey's Royal Circus across the river at Southwark, a new and splendid entertainment, the Triumph of Liberty, or the destruction of the Bastille, complete with guards, militia, citizens, villagers, executions, etc., drew in the crowds at £1 a go. Among those taking a more intellectual view of the French Revolution, but in his way no less excited, was Dr. Richard Price of Newington Green. He was now, in 1789, 66 years old, the Welsh-born son of a dissenting minister who moved to London when he was around 17 to attend a dissenters' academy. We might think of it as a dissenters' university in Moorfields in the city. Price had been a vocal advocate for the American revolutionaries who had won secession from Britain by force of arms from 1776 to 1783. And at Newington Green, he was sought out by many rational intellectuals of his day, including Jeremy Bentham. This was despite what might seem to many a deeply irrational streak in Price's philosophy, his belief in the omnipotence and benevolence of the supreme deity, who would never allow anything to happen that ought not to happen. It was this conviction, perhaps, that led him to see the revolution in France as an entirely beneficial event, an almost revelatory moment for humankind, akin to a biblical prophecy or a sign from God. So it was that on Wednesday, 4 November 1789, he preached a sermon in a city chapel on the love of our country to a meeting of the Society for Commemorating the Revolution in Great Britain. That was the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which had promised religious freedom to dissenters. He concluded with a passage in praise of the French Revolution. He described the people of France as demanding liberty with an irresistible voice, and who had made an arbitrary monarch surrender himself to his subjects. Be encouraged, all ye friends of freedom and writers in its defense. Tremble, all ye oppressors of the world. Take warning, all ye supporters of slavish governments and slavish hierarchies. You cannot now hold the world in darkness. Restore to mankind their rights and consent to the correction of abuses before they and you are destroyed together. He published the sermon in a pamphlet before the year was out. This is 1789, it's very early on. Price's pamphlet began what has since been called the Pamphlet Wars, that lasted especially from 1789 into 1793. Most famous of these publications was Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, 1790, which was a direct response to Price's pamphlet of the few months before, and forecast the descent of the revolution into chaos, violence, and despotism. But not much behind Burke, in the Hall of Fame, came two pamphlets by Mary Wollstonecraft, whose worldwide reputation and inspiration now far outshines that of Price. Her life story is familiar to many, so I won't try to summarize what has already filled numerous volumes of biography and commentary. But in the debate that Price began, she made two contributions that attacked Burke, defended Price, the French Revolution, and its new national constitution in A Vindication of the Rights of Man, 1790, and followed that with the book that has cemented her place in feminist letters ever since, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, published in 1792. But it's worth saying, I think, that she shared something of Price's over-optimistic determinism about the events in France. Even after spending some years in Paris, that city of murder, from 1793 to 95, and witnessing what she called the wicked, the base, the nefarious assassinations which have clouded the vivid prospect, her faith remained unshaken in the natural consequence of intellectual improvement, as she put it, gradually proceeding to perfection in the advancement of communities. It didn't work out too well. I'll mention here two other famous dissenters who were also active in Hackney in these troubled years. One was the Yorkshire-born natural philosopher and scientist Joseph Priestley. He was famously run out of Birmingham by a ferocious church and king crowd in July 1791 after joining in the pamphlet war and extolling the virtues of the events in France. Where else should he find refuge but in Hackney? So he took lodgings in Clapton from November 1791. He succeeded to the ministry at the Old Gravel Pit Chapel after Price's death that same year, and remained there until leaving for America in 1794. The other, less well known now, but of considerable importance in the London of the 1790s, was the Bible scholar Gilbert Wakefield. He was briefly tutor at the Dissenters' new college in Clapton, but it was as a controversialist that he won considerable notoriety. In 1798, he was prosecuted and imprisoned for 3 years at Dorchester jail, Dorchester as far as they could get him away from London, for suggesting the living standards of the poor were so miserably degraded by war that they would welcome the French should they invade. Wakefield's publisher and printers were imprisoned too, in a move that Charles James Fox considered the end of the liberty of the press in England. Wakefield died back home in Hackney, only 45, soon after his release from jail. It's difficult then to overstate the significance of Hackney and its dissenters in the immediate history of the French Revolutionary period in this country. But lest we over-glamorize dissent, it's worth making 2 points here about dissenters and their ideas. First, not all dissenters were radicals, and even radicals might have their blind spots when it came to the rights of man. This is exemplified most sharply when it came to the rights of people shipped across the Atlantic from the enslaving nations of coastal West Africa to the plantations of the British Caribbean. Take the case of William Vaughan, born into a family of London dissenters and educated at Newcome's School in Clapton. Vaughan was a West India merchant who inspired dock reform on the Thames, leading directly to the construction of the West India and London docks between 1799 and 1805. He favored slavery in the slave trade and inherited at least 4 Jamaican plantations, one called Vaughnsfield, from his father Samuel, all producing sugar and rum. They were worked by some 725 enslaved people in total. William Vaughan would receive compensation for the loss of his slave property in the early 1830s. The second point is this: ideas are one thing, action is another. Certainly Hackney generated no shortage of ideas, all in favor, it seems, of the French Revolution and the promise it made for liberty everywhere, including for the people of Great Britain and Ireland. What though of action? Did these ideas actually change things on the ground and influence the behavior of those who wanted change? There is evidence that they did, and this in an important direction. The main plebeian organization inspired by the events in France was the London Corresponding Society, LCS for short. It was the brainchild of one man, Thomas Hardy, a shoemaker born in 1752 in Stirlingshire, north of Glasgow, who migrated to London in 1774 and never returned to the land of his birth. He was a dissenter, member of a congregation in Crown Court, Covent Garden, and a great reader. We know that it was reading Richard Price on the American cause in the early 1780s that turned him into a radical reformer, and he reread Price's writings in 1791. That same year, Hardy drew up a plan for the LCS to campaign for constitutional reform, with universal male suffrage and annual parliaments the key planks in his program. The first meeting of the LCS took place in January 1792. Out of this, invigorated now by the writings of Tom Paine, grew the most vigorous workers' reform agitation of the whole of the period from 1792 to 1815. It was so vigorous that it was outlawed by government in July 1799, after a tempestuous period that saw Hardy on trial for his life, but acquitted of treason by a London jury in 1794. Though certainly very active in its propaganda, the LCS was no revolutionary organization, although it undoubtedly had many revolutionaries within it who went underground after the LCS was outlawed. It sought to achieve its ends by educating workers in the need for parliamentary reform, and it explicitly rejected violence. Members paid a penny a week subscription. The locally based divisions of the LCS meeting weekly, sometimes in the homes and workshops of members, but mainly in one or other of the uncountable number of pubs and alehouses to be found in London's back streets. The numbers of paid-up LCS members in its foundation year of 1792 probably didn't exceed 650. It reached its high point of around 3,000 in the foundation year of in the summer of 1795. Members were a broad spectrum of London's workers by hand and by brain, from professionals, lawyers the most numerous, always at the heart of any trouble, with a few physicians and apothecaries, through small shopkeepers, artisans working on their own account, or as small masters like Hardy, through small shopkeepers to journeymen and labourers. Of just 347 members for whom we have occupational details, the largest trades represented were shoemakers, 43, weavers, silk weavers, 27, and tailors and breeches makers, 24, compared, say, to 8 attorneys and 4 barristers. This plebeian mix, tending firmly to the lower orders, marked the LCS as unique among the organisations agitating for the reform of Parliament and the British Constitution. Nor had there been anything like it before, even in the years of the Civil War. The LCS, organisation and members, vocally admired the French revolutionaries while ostensibly deploring their extreme measures. In imitation, they addressed one another as citizen. What about the LCS in Hackney? I'm afraid there isn't much to say. At least if there is, I don't know about it. Of 110 pubs and meeting places identified from the contemporary records, none was in the parishes of Hackney or Stoke Newington. That reflected, I think, the class and semi-rural makeup of the area as then settled, together with its relative lack of industry and trades connected to strong workers' organisations. If there were members of the LCS living in these parishes, and almost certainly there were, then they attended meetings in or much closer to the City of London. Shoreditch did have an LCS presence, but a very disappointing one. LCS divisions met at the Union Public House in Shoreditch High Street and at the Fountain, Virginia Row, and that's your lot, just 2 out of 110. There were far more, however, in Finsbury and Bethnal Green on either side, and especially in the City of London in the south. Then still, of course, the country's primary manufacturing district for every conceivable consumer commodity. The most controversial of all the LCS's activities in these early couple of years was its friendly contact with the revolutionaries in Paris. In September 1792, the LCS published a congratulatory address to the National Convention of France, transmitted to Paris by the French ambassador in London. The timing could hardly have been worse. Paris weltered in blood during the massacres of that month, when some 1,200 state prisoners and their families, men, women, and children, were slaughtered, with France declaring itself a republic on 20 September. But for the LCS, members of the French National Convention were the champions of human happiness, our fellow citizens of the world and our brethren, while Britons were ever the victims of a restless, all-consuming aristocracy. Frenchmen, you are already free, and Britons are preparing to become so. In the convention, Hardy boasted a few years later, the LCS's communication was received with rapturous applause. The reception was rather different in London. Why? To answer that, we need to consider the roots of what was called at the time and since loyalism. We might call it now common or garden patriotism. And I want to dwell on 2 aspects in particular. One was the behavior of the revolutionary crowd in Paris, which had a particular resonance for Londoners in 1789. The other was the behavior of the French National Convention in relation to its continental neighbors in Austria and the German states in particular. First, then, the Paris crowd. We might start with the fall of the Bastille, one of the most momentous events in world history. News of it took some 6 days to reach newspaper readers in London. That first report in the Times of 20 July 1789 inevitably drew comparisons with the Gordon riots in London less than a decade before, and still crystal fresh in Londoners' minds. Some parallels were precise, almost uncanny. The release of prisoners in the Paris jails, culminating at the Bastille, sacked and later destroyed, recalled the events in London where Newgate had been stormed and put to the torch, and a dozen prisons across the city were forced to free their prisoners. In Paris, as in London, the mansions of the rich, or those out of favour with the people, were attacked and plundered. And just as in 1780, what began as an essentially bourgeois agitation for religious orthodoxy and anti-Catholicism in the case of London, and for constitutional change in France, lost control to what the Times called our sovereign lord, the mob. Yet there were differences too. The London rioters had delighted in destruction for its own sake, with 4 or 5 nights of conflagrations at all points of the compass, devouring property of greater value than would be destroyed in Paris during all the months and years of revolution, just in 5 nights in June 1780. But the London rioters had not lusted for blood. In Paris that 14 July, the ferocity of the crowd was insatiable. The governor of the Bastille and its commander of the guard were dragged to the Place de Grève and beheaded. The crowd stuck their heads on tent poles and carried them in triumph to the Palais Royal and through the streets of Paris. At the Hôtel de Ville, the Lord Mayor was stabbed in various places while attempting to read to the crowd an order from the king. His head was cut off and carried away. Monsieur de Crone, I'm quoting from the newspaper reports in London, the lieutenant de police, shared the same fate, only that he was hung up in the public streets. Just the day before, it was said, that mode of lynching by the ropes which were used to fasten the lanterns had become a fashionable terror. The barbarities continued for some days. Perhaps most horrifying to London readers were the savage murders of Joseph François de Foulon, a deeply loathed Comptroller General of the public finances, and his son-in-law. De Foulon fled Paris on 14 July, but was captured, brought back, tortured in the streets, half-hanged from a lantern, and then beheaded. At the moment I write this article, an anonymous correspondent of the St. James's Chronicle told its readers, his head is passing under my window, and a piece of his greatcoat is now lying on my table, the populace having cut all his clothes to pieces as patriotic relics. In his mouth is a bunch of hay, alluding to an expression he made use of a few days since, that the Parisians must be taught to eat hay. The lesson from the Paris events of July 1789 would not be forgotten in London, and I'll come back to this point at the very end. That similarity with the London crowd was too close for comfort. London had been ruled by terror wielded by untold thousands of its citizens bent on plunder and destruction. What the London crowd had been in June 1780, it might be again. Worse, it might become, with a different sort of leadership, what the Paris crowd was in 1789. This lesson was rammed home at moments of political drama in the years to come, in the House of Commons and in the newspapers, published in their dozens of titles in these challenging times. The other lesson was the revolution's continental repercussions. In April 1792, France declared war on the Austrian Empire, with which Britain had friendly relations. The war between revolutionary France and the great Austrian Empire brought astonishing success to the new French Republic's forces. France had seized the Austrian Netherlands and was threatening to open the River Scheldt and the port of Antwerp to trade at the expense of Britain's ally, Holland. Opening the Scheldt to French forces would pose a direct threat to an attack by London on sea. If you look at London and Antwerp on Google Maps, as I did to check just that I had this right a few minutes ago, they are literally opposite each other. They look as though they're formed of the same fissure in the continental shelf. And on 19 November 1792, the French National Convention issued a decree of fraternity and assistance. It offered all people who wished to recover their liberty the French army's help to do so, and it was ordered to be printed in all languages. All people encompassed the benighted British, ever the victims of a restless, all-consuming aristocracy. These two threats, one external from a rampant France, Britain's oldest and most resolute enemy, now flexing its democratic muscle across the Channel, and one internal from a London crowd infected by revolutionary intent, quickly made loyalism a popular force in London, indeed, the most popular force of all. For a short time, loyalism became embodied in one man, John Reeves, the son of a rich master baker in the city, whose academic brilliance shone through Eton, Oxford, and the Middle Temple. He wrote a history of English law and drafted legislation for a reform of London's police in 1792. Reeves returned from a stay abroad in November 1792. The LCS congratulatory address to the French National Convention had been sent while he was away and had been followed by others. Alarmed at what he considered sedition all around him, he summoned a meeting of gentlemen at the Crown and Anchor Tavern in the Strand. With Reeves in the chair, the meeting formed the Association for Preserving Liberty and Property Against Republicans and Levellers, more commonly called Reeves's Association at the Crown and Anchor, or the Crown and Anchor Association. Its objects were plain enough from the title, but its methods were sophisticated. It encouraged the formation of local associations exercising a neighbourhood watch on publicans, on booksellers, on everyone whose opinions are conveyed in the terms the rights of man, no king, no parliament, and others of like import. Reeves associations were formed all across London. It was said that there were 2,000 Reeves associations within a few months of that meeting at the Crown and Anchor, with 150 in London alone. And there was an association formed, unsurprisingly, given its class makeup, in Hackney, the Hackney Association for the Preservation of Peace, Liberty and Property, which was dominated at the time by clergymen and estate owners, and was no doubt active in informing the magistrates of seditious meetings nearby. On 1st February 1793, France declared war on Britain, and after that, loyalism in Hackney and elsewhere took a more militant and more military guise, with the formation of volunteer associations donning some very picturesque uniforms. I'll tell you a bit about the local volunteers who were formed in Hackney in 1794, which was quite early for these military associations to be formed. This was an era of extravagant display in male dress, the age of Beau Brummel, and the uniforms of the volunteers alone must have brought work to thousands of tailors and seamstresses across the metropolis, leaving aside the uniforms needed for the regular army and others. The Loyal Hackney Volunteers, Hackney's finest, we might think of them, were formed in May 1794. Their objectives were to aid the civil power in case of riot, the enemy within, and to be prepared to fight against an enemy invasion anywhere within 10 miles of the Hackney boundary, so it's a very parochial organisation indeed. Even when united in patriotism, many gentlemen thought journeymen and labourers literally untouchable. Hence, in Hackney, there were two companies of volunteers. One formed of men who bought their own uniforms, weapons and equipment, the other of men whose clothes and so on were paid for by subscription and who received an attendance allowance for twice-weekly drill sessions and target practice at the lime kilns in Clapton. Uniforms were designed for each parish with a keen eye for sartorial distinction. Materials often sumptuous and expensive. The local Hackney volunteers wore cocked hats without rims, a piece of bearskin across the front, converting them to helmets, a blue short coat with scarlet collars and cuffs, white breeches and black knee-length gaiters. The St. Leonard Shoreditch volunteers wore scarlet coats with blue collar and cuffs, and they wore tight white breeches with rather fetching black ankle boots. During the uneasy period of peace between 1801 and 1803, most volunteer companies were stood down, as was the case in Hackney. But in the lead up to May 1803, when the United Kingdom, as it had now become, declared war on France, the volunteers were revived. There were 27,000 local volunteers who were exercising in Hyde Park at the end of 1803. You could tell this was one of the most popular movements of this whole period in Britain. Resumption of war in 1803 certainly didn't damage the martial ardor of the local Hackney volunteers. We know this because a sham fight was organised in Wood Green in May 1804, where the Islington volunteers were cast as the English, and the Hackney and Stoke Newington volunteers were cast as the French. The battle was for possession of a bridge, but sadly no one had determined who should take the bridge and who should retire from the field. It became a general brawl, the sham part forgotten in the heat of battle. One man was stabbed in the thigh by a bayonet, others were stunned and bruised by wadding fired from muskets, the wounded conveyed home in post-chaises. The fracas made a paragraph in newspapers from Belfast to Calcutta. Hackney politics in this period, we know nothing. There were no local newspapers until the 1850s. But we do know something about Hackney politics in the parliamentary elections and the parliamentary disputes of the early 19th century. And I just wanted to have a word here about the Mermaid Tavern, which became in many ways a centre of Hackney radicalism in this period. If I can find my bit. Just west of Mare Street, the Mermaid Tavern was a well-known place. It had extensive grounds, including 2 bowling greens, a brook, and a dark walk for canoodling among the trees on summer evenings. It was used for auctions and weddings and was very much the centre of local culture among the better class of tippler. In the early 1800s, it was kept by Mary Bristow, and from 1811 it became a popular venue for ballooning. In 1837, the only known flight by 3 female aeronauts alone in the balloon was launched from the Mermaid Tavern in 1837. The Mermaid was a centre of radical meetings from the 1790s onwards and became a scene of hectic meetings for the Middlesex parliamentary elections in the early 19th century and after. I'm just going to have to wind up. I thought I had more time than I've got. I just wanted to say how at the end of the period, stepping back as it were, Hackney played a really important part in the generation of pro-French ideas in the early years of the French Revolution. It was in very much, the seedbed of middling sort agitation, at least in terms of the pamphlet wars. With the declaration of war, Hackney loyalism became, just as loyalism was elsewhere, a very strongly living force. The Hackney volunteers weren't stood down until well after the invasion scare had passed. They were stood down, I think, in 1811 or 1812. So they were in existence throughout. And to a certain extent, that sort of criticized the relationship between, as it were, those who were in favor of revolution, people like the LCS, and who were in favor of the French Revolution, and those who, as it were, actively stood up for king and country in Hackney, which was the Hackney local volunteers. And I'll wind up there. Thanks very much.
So we do have time for a few questions, if I can see hands. Got one at the front here.
Hi, Jerry. What happened, what impact do you think the radicals in Hackney had on the political views taken by Hackney in the early half of the 19th century?
It's really difficult to know. We do know that because the meetings at the Mermaid Tavern were of county significance. Middlesex County, which was had a large democratic vote, only about 6,000 voters in a population of over 500,000 in Middlesex. But we do know that it supported radical candidates, Middlesex. And we know that most of the meetings in the Mermaid Tavern favoured radical candidates. But we know nothing about the operation of the Hackney vestry. It's never reported in the London newspapers. It's not significant enough. One imagines there are politics there, as in every other sort of local community. But we just don't have any sense of what they might be. The vestry tended to be very much dominated by the clergyman, and the church, it was still, as it were, although it had local government powers, it was still very Orthodox Church of England based. So it's unlikely that there would have been much radicalism expressed in the locality. But in terms of Hackney's position in parliamentary elections, then the meetings at the Mermaid Tavern show that it was pretty much a radical base. And that's for radical middle class people, essentially. Because they're the ones with the vote. They're the ones with the freeholders. It was a freeholder vote in Middlesex. And it was their voice which was heard most dominantly in the Mermaid Tavern.
Hi. What do you think it is about Hackney that it became a place which fostered such radicalism?
Well, it's an interesting point. I mean, I think that the sort of, I know Tony's going to be talking about Hackney Council in a minute and its history. I don't think we can read too much back into the past from the Hackney of today. It's a very different place. And, the impact of multiculturalism, which we've heard about, throughout the day, was something that, didn't exist in the Hackney of 1789 to 1815. And indeed, my impression, not that I know a great deal about Hackney politics in the 19th or early 20th century, but that you wouldn't have really characterized Hackney as a very radical place for much of the past, until you really do get, to the period from the late 60s onwards, I think. So I don't think we can read too much. I mean, I've been talking about radicalism, and it was clearly in existence, but it was a very different phenomenon than what, we're living with now here.
Yes, I'd be interested to know whether the radicals who supported, the Stoke Newington radicals who supported the French Revolution also supported the revolution in Haiti, led by Toussaint Louverture, which was the only successful slave rebellion of its time, and was as you probably know, betrayed by Napoleon.
Really, I don't think it figured. In terms of the London press, the revolution in Saint-Domingue, as it was called then, or in Haiti from 1791 on, really was a thing to be deplored because it seemed to forecast revolution and dissent in Britain's Caribbean colonies, which were still of very great economic significance to London as a whole through sugar imports, basically, and through the whole of the West India trade. So whenever Saint-Domingue was mentioned in the London press, it was seen as a thing of terror and a thing to be, avoided. And but the lessons were strictly confined to the Caribbean context, rather than having any political context within Britain itself.